Alliances or even political alignments are the most expected moves during elections. Now, early this year, Democratic Alliance parliamentary leader Lindiwe Mazibuko said most opposition parties in South Africa are committed to the idea of a coalition. There haven't been such effective coalitions in our country. Is it because of very diverse political views or the fear of being swallowed up or even mistrust among political parties? Well, let's chat now to Professor Susan Booysen. She's a political analyst and a senior lecturer at Wits Graduate University. Good to have you. Welcome.
Good morning.
Did you rest a little bit over this weekend after last week?
A little bit, but definitely much more than last week.
Enough to get you going, because elections are over, but there's so much more to talk about. I mean, it hasn't come to an end. We still got, from presidential inaugurations, new cabinet ministers, perhaps the thought of new deputy presidents in our country. I mean, there's just a lot happening in our political landscape.
We have just passed the quiet period, yes.
The quiet period, I like that. I do like that. All right, let's start off with the first point of coalitions. After looking at the results coming out of the elections, I mean, are there any worthwhile coalitions to look at this point?
Now, coalitions come about two ways. In the first place, to challenge the governing party. In other words, you must be closer to majorities than what parties in South Africa are.
Yeah.
And because we have a proportional representation system, and because there is no more any floor crossing in South Africa, it is a pretty stable situation in terms of that until the next election comes. And so we are much more likely to see developments in opposition party alliances. Perhaps this left alliances comes about, perhaps the EFF eventually lines up with, if NUMSA splits from COSATU and a new left formation comes about there, with some worker support, then some prospects arise for a stronger left alliance. But in terms of the established little parties, you know, when we talk about alliances between 1% parties and 5 or 6 parties that can pull together 5% in parliament or in a legislature, that really doesn't make any impact on South African politics. So it is a longer term prospects, and when it comes to the DA, they're one of the most outspoken voices for alliances, but they've already just about swallowed all of the smaller parties with which they could have had alliances. We've seen the ID, for example. They're right in there.
We're looking at Patricia de Lille on the screen right now. I mean, that was one party that was swallowed up.
Yes.
You know, the idea, I don't think it's a party anymore. It isn't, is it?
It isn't. They are completely merged
merged together now. But I can't see. Let's look at the EFF. I mean, there was even that wild rumour going around before the elections that there could be a joining or a coalition or a working together of the DA and the EFF. Now that, I'm not sure that's going to... Is that something could ever happen?
That was one of the funniest moments of the campaign, I think, when people started talking. There had been a meeting, okay, there may have been a meeting, but a coalition between EFF and DA in order to oust the ANC. That would have been a very interesting situation had the ANC in Gauteng been pushed below the 50% level. And then who would align with whom? EFF with ANC or DA with EFF. A few other small parties could have come into the equation. But the bottom line for an alliance is cooperation. That cooperation must really be possible on political policy and program issues. And that's the parties, apart from opposing corruption, would not have been able to cooperate on much else. But that is interesting. In many African countries, we have seen alliances between parties that really have quite a lot of divergences between them, yet they shared a singular common purpose to oust a corrupt party from power. And it's in those situations, but more likely in presidential than in parliamentary systems as well, for those kind of coalitions and alliances to take off.
Any moving away from coalitions now, any complaints come up during this now? I know there have been a few complaints come up after the elections, some parties objecting to the results and issues like that. Anything that's noteworthy? Anything we need to sort of pay particular attention to?
No, the history with objections in the electoral process is that it goes into the extensive processes of mediation and conciliation most of the time through the IEC and their arbitration procedures. And the end result has always been that there has been some agreement, like in these objections had not been enough to substantively affect the outcome of the election. And that is when parties really decide to let it go away. In a small way, I think we saw that happening in terms of the Alexandra objections late last week. On Friday, that township was really, really on a knife's edge, had been building up to that. The EFF had previously said it's likely not to accept the Gauteng result because there had just been so many problems, and Alexandra, which is one of the real strongholds in Gauteng, was going up in flames. It was contained, and I believe the EFF's statement that they will accept the Gauteng result did a lot to help quell the problems and push it back into relative peace.
So it seems at this point that the results have been accepted by all political parties that have been involved, and that's just the picture. What was announced, that's what we can expect going forward for the next 5 years.
There will still be ongoing attention to the problems, but without major effect, I think, at least if we can rule by previous experiences that we've had.
Well, let's look at what arose after the election. So I think one of the big things to come out of it, let's start off with the DA, Lindiwe Mazibuko, saying that she's going to step out of that position, go and study overseas, which I think is an amazing opportunity for her. But what's that going to do to the party? Do you think it's a bit of a negative thing or not really?
The party seems to have been taken by surprise. No, a clear announcement over the weekend. People had not been briefed on that before. And that really upsets the apple cart a bit, because as Helen Zille, and it was assumed that in due course she will make place either for Mmusi Maimane, who does not become Premier of Gauteng, or to Lindiwe Mazibuko. And Lindiwe Mazibuko has been a parliamentary leader, and there's a clear gap that arises there. She has played a big role there to help create this new image for the ANC, and it's had great impact on leaders. I think many of that proportion of black African, South African voters that have now turned to the DA would have done it because of leaders like her really making a big impact there. And the DA has got, as they like to point out, quite a substantial number of black African supporters now, besides minorities and coloured and Indian communities. But I haven't got a person who has been groomed to that extent, ready to fill big openings, gaps in Parliament. So I think this is a very clear setback. We see speculation that who moves in there, Mmusi Maimane maybe would have moved out in there anyway. Maybe Lindiwe saw that kind of writing on the wall that he is going to be pushed into those positions, and she decided to exit. We know there have been policy clashes between her and Helen Zille, where she has grown into those big positions like parliamentary leader, but then was given limited space to improvise NDA policy.
We saw that, and she spoke about it in newspapers yesterday, just talking about those disagreements between the two ladies, but that's how politics works. On the corner of my eye, I'm actually seeing on the Business Day, they're saying that Mazibuko exit Messi Zille back in Parliament. Is this a possibility?
There is a small possibility, I believe so, but I read in that article it seems more speculation from various sources that that may be the case coming up. I think Helen Zille actually has a big responsibility, whether she is the Premier in the Western Cape, to push that project and lead from the front there, rather than just going into Parliament and debating as an opposition party. Although we would have loved to see her and Julius Malema debating in Parliament.
That would be great.
But we're never going to see the Julius Malema, at least not for now, and Lindiwe Mazibuko debating.
That's another thing as well. I know we spoke about it quite extensively during election week, how Parliament is suddenly going to be a very, very interesting place to be in and also to watch. I don't think many people are going to be sleeping in their parliamentary seats these days.
The sleeping days are over.
They're gone. The red suits are going to cause a little bit of chaos that's happening there. I know there's so much more to talk about. We'll talk about it all. Presidential inauguration on the 24th, cabinet ministers, deputy president, you name it. But we'll have a lot more time to talk about that.
Indeed, so much of that coming coming up, and so many schemes and lineups that we hear about. Fascinating business unfolding.
Absolutely. Suzanne Booysen, professor from Wits University, talking to us all about post-elections and stories that have come out, and also our news that e-tolls are going up straight after the elections. I'm not saying it's related to elections, but reading that on Saturday morning, it didn't make my heart skip a beat at all. Made me a little bit cross, I have to tell you. I didn't need that news on the day after the elections. Anyway, that's my opinion. I don't know what you feel about that. Let us know. Let's take a break. When we return, the main news bulletin at 7 o'clock with Ayanda.